Hello everyone, welcome back to another True Potential Do More With Your Money podcast. So the good news is that we are pretty much halfway through this election campaign, and just a few weeks to go we'll know the outcome. But this week, of course, it's been manifesto week, so we've got a slightly better idea of what all of the major parties are going to be offering us at this election. And we're going to pick the bones out of that today with our panel. Here joining me in the studio today, to my right-hand side, we've got James Wood, financial advisor, also Jamie Sexton, another one of our financial advisors, Kevin Kinney in the middle there, the investment director here at True Potential, and at the end of the table, George Bell, our portfolio manager. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello, Peter.
Have you been deep into manifestos this week and reading back-to-back pages of every possible manifesto you can get your hands on? I take it you have?
Yeah, back-to-back pages, of course. Yeah,
It's been non-stop.
Highlights, I would say, instead.
Well, I tried to with the Labour one today, Peter, and when I clicked on it, it crashed the system. So
did it?
Yeah, I'm presuming I wasn't the only one clicking it at that time.
Oh well, let's hope that's not an omen.
So let's hope not.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to get through, and I mean, in some ways there is, because there are some genuine sort of new policies being announced from some of the smaller parties, let's say the more fringe parties, but from the mainstream parties, actually, we haven't had an awful lot, and perhaps that's a very good reason that we'll come into over the next half an hour or so. We'll talk about some of the major policy announcements, but also crucially, and this is the difference, we're not just here to talk about politics. The difference on this podcast is we want to talk about what it might mean for your money, and that's the key thing. So on that note, George, I'm going to come to you first. As I said at the start, we are pretty much halfway through now, almost exactly halfway through this campaign. Has there been any impact that you've noticed on markets that you can attribute directly a result to the election, or are they taking it in their stride?
Not directly to the election. It's there's much bigger aspects on the global stage at the moment, particularly inflation, particularly the data we're getting around economic growth, corporate earnings, how businesses are actually performing in this environment, and ultimately what it all means for interest rate policy as well. So there's much bigger factors which we're discussing on our morning market updates at this stage.
Yeah. So maybe it's the other way around then, Kevin, because in a funny kind of way, inflation has, every time I see any of the politicians on TV, on any of the debates, inflation is one of the major topics they talk about. We had the news this week about economic growth being a fairly flat April, and they blamed it on the weather. So rather than the election affecting markets are actually, if you like, making some of the weather around what the politicians are doing. It's more that way around, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly setting the backdrop, and I think again next week we get inflation for the month of May. We might actually see inflation below 2%. So in any other election round you would have thought that would be a bit of a boon for the current government, but it doesn't seem to be the case this time round.
And do you think some of that is the polls haven't really shifted in the election campaign? They've been pretty much where they've been for the last year or so, if not longer. So do you think to some extent markets have just kind of priced in a lot of what we're seeing in the political space? And therefore that's perhaps why there's not much...
And also both the Conservatives and Labour have roughly agreed separately to keep the current balance of spending versus revenue. There's some differences, but nobody really has pledged any massive spending programme or massive sort of tax cuts.
Yeah.
There's something at the margin, but nothing really that would rile markets.
Yeah, I think the trust budget is still...
Exactly. The legacy for that will be decades.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the sort of key... I mean, we've had this week... most, if not all, of the major parties have done their manifesto launches. I've particularly got some highlights here from the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, Labour and the Green Party as well that I want to come on to, because there are some issues here that will directly affect people's pensions, their investments. But I'll come to you first, George. Maybe would you perhaps give us one or two highlights, or at least major points, if you like, from the Conservatives who launched their manifesto earlier this week?
Certainly. I'll maybe start with national insurance. So 2p reduction in terms of national insurance, and the second aspect being affecting 4 million workers in the UK, being the abolishment of national insurance for self-employed.
Yeah.
So two important aspects to consider there.
And Jamie and James, bringing that to you then. So on the national insurance, this would be the Tories have cut national insurance twice so far this year. There was one in January, another one in April. None of that shifted the polls at all, right? Didn't do anything. So do you think, were you a bit surprised that they've chucked another one when it hasn't worked the previous two times?
I think, Peter, I remember talking about this at the time, and we kind of thought, have they done enough? Will it have a huge effect on on the work, because obviously national insurance is the workers' tax. Effectively,
Yeah.
that's what they're trying to hit in terms of we help working people. But that's such a little effect because it's, I think, in certain respects people probably haven't felt or seen that because of the cost of living crisis as well. So I don't know. It's an interesting one because I think they've obviously wanted to go forward to say we're going to cut taxes, we're going to do this. I'm not sure it's had any effect at all.
Yeah.
And I think obviously we've talked about it before, is the size of the state pension, for example. Further cuts to national insurance. We've discussed how that may impact in the future.
Yeah.
It just feels like throwing another one on top without any real future plan. And we'll come on and talk about what the future plan was in terms of the state pension. It just seems almost a bit of a throwaway comment, in my opinion. From
It's
that
weird,
side.
isn't it, though? Because it is real. I mean, I just had a little look at my pay slip last month and compared it to one, say, from the end of last year. And the reduction is real. It's real money, right? It is money that it's less tax that we're all paying. And
Have you felt it though, Peter?
Well, that's my point, is that you almost feel you should feel it. But of course you don't, because it just gets washed up in the round. It's not, I don't want to sound ungrateful for anyone giving me a tax cut, far better in my pocket. But
totally
but it's maybe I'm not the target for it, but it just didn't feel like it made a huge difference. Like I said, I don't want to sound ungrateful, and I'm sure the intention's probably right. Reducing tax at this time of the when people are feeling it in their pay packets is a very noble thing to do, some would say, but it isn't cutting through. That's my point. It's not really making a difference in the polls. So I was quite surprised that they went for a third shot at it.
I think it's a tough one for Sunak. I've watched him on both interviews recently, and it's very clear he's getting frustrated because he feels like he has a plan. He feels like these are the things he's bringing through, cutting taxes in this way. He feels like he's had an effect on inflation, and they've done a good job of getting that down over the period of time. But it doesn't get out of voters' mind what happened with the Truss mini budget, and potentially what's happened over the last 14 years as well. And it's that his election we're seeing it as a sort of Labour policy, which is always going back on, well, look what you've done over the last 14 years. And I think it's very difficult for him to move away from that. So a tax cut of 2 pence is it exciting for people? I'm not sure that's to clear a 20-point poll. It's quite difficult.
And on the subject of taxes, I mean, they've said, both parties, Labour and the Tories, have said they're not going to increase income tax, VAT, or national insurance. So that doesn't leave an awful lot of well, it does in some respects. It makes you then wonder, where are you going to generate money from for the economy, because you've just ruled out 3 of the obvious main tax generating things you could do. So that's a question perhaps we'll come to shortly, because there are other parties who've talked about this, and we'll move on to them in a second. Just lastly, on the Conservatives, George mentioned it, the pensions triple lock plus. So we know what the triple lock is. Just for anyone who doesn't, James, just remind us what the triple lock is, and we'll get about the plus bit.
Yeah, so the triple lock is obviously the increase that was brought in by the Conservative government in terms of the increase in state pension on a yearly basis. So it's based on, as we've discussed, 2.5% CPI inflation or average wage growth within the UK, whichever is the highest out of those. The triple lock plus obviously is taking it slightly a step further, and I know we'll come on and talk about it in more detail. What for me was good to see as well, Labour have kept to the triple lock. That was something that, as an active advisor, was quite a big concern up until we obviously had the manifesto announcement. So quite good to see.
And the plus element of that, Jamie, being that the personal allowance, i.e. the bit you can earn before paying tax, they're saying they'll always keep that ahead of the state pension, so you'd never pay tax on the state pension. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Peter. It's trying to keep that above the that personal allowance, which is a great thing for pensioners, which is something the sort of Tories are trying to push in terms of being there for pensioners.
Let's move it on then to the Labour Party, because and I'll keep with the pensions theme, because where just before in a way of sort of transitioning into Labour, you mentioned, well, we talked previously on podcasts about the lifetime allowance. Now, what's the current state of play on the lifetime allowance, Jamie?
Well, basically the Conservatives, they didn't abolish it, they capped it at a certain level, and the rumours were, well, Keir Starmer the day after came out and said, don't you worry, when I get in, I'll put that back in place. So a lifetime allowance for anyone sort of listening is the sort of maximum amount that you can put in your pension before you start getting additional taxed, which is now not the case. He's now come out and said that he won't change it. I think that's the rumours kicking around. I do hope that, now my worry with this, with all pensions, Peter, and lifetime allowance is just one form of tax on a pension. You've got your 25% tax-free lump sum that you can get, and then income tax on anything above that. And My worry is that sometimes with pensions, they're used as a political puppet.
And that the risk of that's got to have gone up because of what we said before about them having closed off
completely.
other tax raising
It's
options they would have had. So you do then put things like pensions. I hope they don't, whoever forms the next government, but it does mean
I just
pensions
hope
could be a target.
I hope they leave them alone, because coming from somebody that advises many people on pensions over the last few years, one of the hardest things we have to do is actually explain, depending on where their pension is, the date that they actually opened it up in certain cases. You know, some people did have this in terms of lifetime allowance sort of protections in place, so now that's obviously depending on whether that's needed or not. There's so many different elements to a pension now, and it's because of these changes over this period of time is why
We need people like you.
Yeah, it is. And
Well, it keeps you doing a job, so that's all right, isn't it?
But how, you know, if you look at it, compare that to an ISA, which is such a simple product, you know, you put £20,000 in a year, it's, you know, tax-free go, and it's tax-free coming out. It's such a simple product from that perspective. I just hope that they just leave them alone. And, you know, people that have, because there actually is some real benefits to having a pension. And it can cause you, especially as an advisor, where you can only recommend based on what the legislation is today, and all of a sudden if that changes in 4 or 5 years' time, you know, or within the next 4 or 5 years' time, it can be really difficult. So I just do hope they leave those alone.
Right, Kevin, let's come to you then. What for the Labour Party? What has, and they've had their manifesto launched today while we're recording this. What particularly jumped out at you? So
straight away, Financial Times headline was Labour to raise £8.5 billion from tax increases. So that's mostly coming from VAT and business rates on private schools, and something called closing the loophole on carried interest. So this is the idea of big profits made by partners in private equity. Those are going to be taxed as income, not as capital gains together, and that with some other things around the edges, about £8 billion. So it's quite a lot actually, and that is going to help them with their spending programmes, particularly on the NHS. And they've pledged, obviously, about, I think it's 6,500 teachers as well. That's probably to offset what they expect will be some swing from the private school system back into the state school system. So it's at the margin. So what they're not doing is they're sticking to their word at the moment and not taxing income. They're looking at these smaller pots, non-DOMs, which the Conservatives have taken from them anyway, the private equity and the private schools. So there's not a lot else really for them to lean into. I mean, this is a high tax economy right now as it is, and I'm not sure where else they could raise they could perhaps, well, there's other things they could do. They could perhaps bring back in the fuel duty escalator, which is the penny on petrol, but
they're not mentioning that just at this stage.
No.
I mean, part of some of the commentators write up today on the Labour manifesto was that there was actually nothing new in there that hadn't been already talked about.
No surprises.
So no surprises. Now, again, going back to what we said about markets, you know, the Labour Party's job here is to be the next government. So we're going to break with the continuity and have something fresh. That's what they're hoping for. So in some ways, is a you know, I mean, to some people it might be radical, but to others, you know, there was nothing new. So is that a good thing for markets, that we're not going to have an incoming government that's going to do things massively different straight away?
The best comparison we've got is the behaviour in the stock market in the UK with the behaviour in the stock market in France last week. So you have carnage in France because of the snap parliamentary elections. The French stock market is down about 5% on the week because markets have no idea what the makeup for the next parliament there will be, and they don't like uncertainty. And the UK isn't entirely unaffected by what's going on in France, but markets here are pretty certain that it's going to be a Labour government with a large majority, and they are going to possibly have one of the largest post-war parliamentary mandates to do very little. So markets like that boring.
I mean, in some ways, had they come out today with 3, 4, 5 big rabbits out the hat, that might have spooked. Could have spooked markets a bit as well. So perhaps maybe that's what they were having a mind on, is not.
I think there will be
boats.
something. By the way, I found it really difficult. Come the day of the result, I found it very difficult to believe that they're going to wait until September until the OBR have checked all the homework before they announce anything.
Yeah.
I think there will be some surprises, but it will be.
Well, you'd imagine they'll do an emergency budget. And I mean, politicians, by the way, obsess about 100 days.
Yeah.
It's completely arbitrary, but it's just one of those things they all do. So they'll all do this. What are you going to do in your first 100 days?
Yeah.
There'll be an emergency budget in the first 100 days for sure. To some extent, there might even be, if the Conservatives win, they might do a reset budget. So the first 100 days, you can imagine, will be let's just see what we can do and make some headlines. On the private schools thing that Kevin mentioned there, that has caught a lot of media attention. It's not a new idea. It's been talked about for a long time, for months now, really. What's your view, Jamie, on it? I mean, is it something that you think you could support, or do you think it's politics of envy, as it's been called? Where do you stand?
It's a funny one because I went to a private school and plan on sending my 2 little boys. I've discussed this quite a number of times in terms of how I save and why I've set it up for that, and so it will affect me personally. And I've tried to look at it from a sort of a non-personal perspective in terms of, I know this monetary will affect me. I'm not sure if it's targeted at more wealthier people who I don't think it won't make any difference to them. I think you're going to see this middle earner, probably someone like myself, where you're working really hard, you want to send your kids there because that's where I went from that perspective, and there'll be parents that struggle to do that now, and I'm kind of looking at it from a perspective of are we going to see more people go from private into state because of this? Will that affect? And I haven't really sort of made a view on it. It's probably it's one of the key policies that will affect me with a Labour government, which will likely sway my vote.
I mean, this is an interesting thing. A lot of people might think, well, does any of this really affect me? We talked about the 2p national insurance that affects all of it. Well, anyone knows at work. Yeah, it's not noticed. What you're saying is it's because it's 20%.
It will affect.
This is a very noticeable policy that will absolutely, you will definitely notice that in the way maybe you hadn't noticed the national insurance thing.
Keir Starmer's been getting asked about it on pretty much every sort of every time they get an opportunity, and he was a little bit different on the vote on the yesterday on Sky, where he acted a little bit more sympathetic about it, but he didn't quite call it a tax increase, because it's not. He's just removed the exemption. That's the way he's obviously describing it. So. Many people will affect.
I mean, let's be clear. That is absolutely
correct. Well, this is the point.
You call it but the exemption, but the bottom line is the same. It's going to be 20% extra on the price.
It's a complete tax season, and the average person, I know private school fees range from £50,000 for your more expensive schools, but average around the UK is between 15 and 20,000. So it's 20% on that. It's not a slow increase. So it's a funny one. I've got 2 little boys who are just starting school now, so that's quite It'd be interesting for people that are halfway through their school life and their parents potentially can't afford it anymore. How will that affect them?
I know personally for myself, same as Jamie, I went to private school. I know that 100%, if there had been that exemption removed before I went, my parents wouldn't have sent me there. And it sounds silly, it's a trivial thing, but I had a very good time. I enjoyed myself a lot there. Would I probably have had a different experience, if that had been the case? Well, I would have gone to state school, and yet I still think it would have been the same. So private school's always been a personal choice for people. Will this make as much of a difference as what people first think? Well, that choice is still there. It just maybe comes down to those who aren't the ultra wealthy, they aren't the very high earners, but the medium earners, the middle class households who have made that choice.
And from your experience, then, if the Labour Party were to win the election, and let's say in that first 100 days typical thing, they implement that policy, does that catch people for the coming up academic year, or have you already paid, if you like, for this year? So will it be from next year?
Some schools are, it's interesting what's going on, but there's some schools are allowing you to pay up to 3-4 years worth of fees now, to cover yourself on the back of it. Whether that's exempt or not, I don't know. I think they've got to manage this well. I think it's for someone like myself, where my little boy's, he's in nursery, he's starting school next September. At least I've got a view. This is how much it's going to cost. I think for people who are in that system now, like imagine having to take your child out of school, and go, and it's going to be difficult. Imagine, and it's a big increase. So I think that's who I emphasise for, where there is, and it's not all, from a private school perspective, I had pretty humble beginnings from where I was brought up. It's not all wealthy people. This isn't gonna just affect your Edens, etc. of the world. It's not all wealthy people. So I think I understand. He played it from a basis where he needs to get some money, and he wants it's to play on the educational system as a whole. I get that, and that's where the policy is. At least he's being clear with that before his vote. I just do empathise with certain parents
Okay. Right, let's move on to the Lib Dems then, because they've had an interesting campaign, haven't they? Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because Ed Davey, who's the leader of the Lib Dems, has done a rather odd campaign. He's been jumping off paddleboards in Lake Windermere and going down water slides and all sorts. I mean, not your typical thing for an election campaign. Has that sort of caught any of your attention? Have you seen any of that? Has it worked?
I've seen it all.
And you never want to see it again, do you?
Well, I think it's a party that's desperate for media coverage, and that's their shtick. They just need Ed Davey in a swimming pool or doing something that will get 30 seconds on the TV.
Do you think it's the same with the Labour policies? And it's a funny. Normally, when you say an election, it's about policy and this is what we're going to do, etc. But because we're getting to this pendulum swing of, the people have had enough of certain parties, do you think it is just a case of, I'll just be really, really quiet and do something silly, not talk about my policies, just get some attention, and I'm the canny guy that fell in the river?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the Labour strategy seems to be just steady as she goes, don't make any mistakes.
It is. Yeah.
I think the Liberals want attention, and I think that's what that can be the only explanation for the campaign they're running. I mean, I'm sort of laughing at it, but on the one hand, you think, is that what we've come to? Is that what it is now? Just go and fall off a paddleboard and that's and that's it. I mean, I don't know, but anyway, I'll leave personal views to one side. What was the main? So they've had some issues. They've had some things to say about capital gains tax, and again, that will affect our viewers.
Yeah.
That's what's most important here. What have they said genuinely about CGT?
So they're looking at CGT reforms and raising 50 billion through that channel.
5 billion.
Sorry, 50. Did I say 50? Do you know, this is interesting because we're kind of looking at key policies like prior to this session. And you kind of know the main sort of party ones, but then you kind of go further down.
But I mean, if I so CGT, for example, give our viewers and listeners to this, why would they pay? Where would they pay CGT? So if someone's just a typical investor with true potential, how might they run into CGT?
Well, if you've got a general investment account as an example, any growth on a general investment account at point of sale, you'll pay CGT.
Yeah.
If you've got a second property, and you're selling that second property, you'll pay CGT. So there's different types of different asset sales on that perspective. So it'd be interesting, from a savings perspective, because you've kind of got your £20,000 ISA limit, which is tax free from that perspective. But
so it won't affect your pension or your ISA.
No.
But it's more investment. It's assets, basically, investments and
something
that aren't in a wrapper.
It's something that's been hammered for the last couple of years, though.
Yeah.
So if we think about where the allowances were, scrolling back, we've gone from 12,300 now down to £3,000. To think of kind of further either a tax increase or a cut to that allowance yet again, it's really hammering down on second properties.
But is it question for all of us? Is it smart politics? Is CGT? It's not something that people run into every day, like income tax they do and all that. So is it one of those taxes that you can raise or you can reduce thresholds without doing much damage in terms of what the public see? So is it smart politics? On the other hand, do you think it's anti-aspirational in the sense of you're saying that people who've decided to invest and build a future for their family, that we're now going to jack up the tax at the end of that process when you come to sell? Smart politics or anti-aspirational?
I think it's in between. I think there is
That's a politician's answer.
There is so little room to raise taxes on incomes.
Yeah.
The tax burden genuinely is very acute, that they are looking for things which are a bit abstract for your average consumer or household.
Yeah.
Most people aren't affected by capital gains tax because they have an efficient tax wrapper.
Yeah.
I remember 20 years ago that one of the Lib Dems' key policies was a penny on income tax. You're just not going to get that now because the tax burden is so high. So it's all of the parties are desperately searching for ways they can, apart from the Conservatives, the way they can raise taxes without it appearing on income. And it's just really,
even
really
there,
hard.
the Conservatives have run into some trouble on tax thresholds. So I know when Rishi Sunak says taxes are coming down, that may be true in terms of national insurance, but then there's the bigger question around if more people are being, and there's a lot of assumptions in that people's wages will drag them in, and we don't know that. So I guess that's the debate. But if you do have wage growth over the next 5 years, and you do get dragged into a higher tax band, so the tax burden on those people would go up.
It's very acute. I mean, in the United States, last year they raised the tax threshold in line with inflation, and they've kept the tax rates at very low levels. So, if you were to compare, we often compare our economy with the US. If you compare our income tax system with the US, it's highly punitive. We are taxed 60 to 70% more on income than your average US household. There are other taxes in the US, but they also they don't have VAT, for instance. They don't have national insurance. So I think there is no room to tax income anymore, and all the governments know it. And you can see that the growth impulse in the UK is very, very low. And it's one of the reasons is the cost of living.
Okay. Right, let's move on to the Greens, because again they had their manifesto launch earlier this week. And James, what did you take from that?
Wealth taxes. The key trigger words. So a 1% wealth tax on someone who has assets over £10 million, 2% on someone who has assets over £1 billion. Not going to affect the vast majority of people. But we can see from the amounts that we're talking about there, it could be quite a big stimulus coming back in as well. One that may start to affect people, though, if something goes very weirdly in the election and the Green Party are in 3 weeks' time, an 8% tax, national insurance on people who are that higher rate, the 40% taxpayers, over £50,270. So the wealth taxes is obviously the one to grab the headlines. That national insurance at 8% is...
Well, I mean, the Greens have got some big policies to pay for, because they want $50 billion a year for the NHS by 2030, an extra $20 billion for the care sector. So they've got some big... Now, of course, if you borrowed those sort of sums, you'd be back in the trust territory.
Of course.
So you're going to have to, if you want to do that, you're going to have to raise some taxes significantly. And of course, I guess that leads into their policies. You mentioned, who knows? Who knows where we'll end up? I don't think anyone's expecting the Green Party to form the majority government, but there's an outside chance we might be in some kind of like rainbow coalition of. The polls would have to narrow massively in the next 3 weeks for even to be in that territory. But you never know. We might end up in a situation where someone's got to be the kingmaker. I doubt it, but...
We never know, but I'm fairly sure we do, given what the polls are saying.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you'd asked me 3 weeks ago, I might have thought it was going to narrow, but we're halfway through and it hasn't really. So, anyone got any thoughts on... is that, at least they're being, they've got some big spending policies, but you can't argue that they, don't have a plan, if you like, to raise a lot of that money. So is that credible?
I would have thought if you have £1 billion in assets, you probably have that in a very efficient vehicle. Say it's in a family trust, or you have a number of very skilled people managing that efficiently. You can't tax.
Not like
you can't go
there.
2% and expect someone to have several £1 million in cash. Those assets will be property or company holdings, etc. It's just not realistic. Norway have tried a wealth tax, implemented it, and a number of very wealthy people have moved to Switzerland. Basically, wealth taxes on the ultra wealthy lead to people leaving, and the assets get redomiciled. So it's not necessarily counterproductive. It's just that it may not raise. It would be unlikely to raise the taxes that were written on paper.
Yeah, George, bring you back in then. So we've heard. Some of the main policies from the major parties who've had manifestos this week, and of course there are other parties as well, and they will have had their own policies, but we haven't got time to get into them all today. The key point though is that slightly whatever gets announced and whoever wins, your job is just to navigate a way through all of it to the benefit of our clients. Tell us a bit about how you do that, diversification being the key, but tell us a bit how you almost like rise above all this noise and hysteria and just focus on clients.
Well, a key part's looking beyond the UK as a source of return. It is an area in which we do invest through equities, through bonds, through infrastructure, but the majority of our assets are overseas. The majority of our assets are in the United States, in Europe, across Japan, and in the emerging market space as well. It's diversified across company shares, it's bonds, it's infrastructure, which has an impact there, and also one of the key areas in which you feel political development is through the currency markets, and it's about not having 100% of your assets in sterling. It's having a hedged approach in terms of where you invest in there. So we've got dollar exposure, euro exposure in there as well, just as a few examples. So it's looking at the world as a global stage and partnering with managers who can get you investments around that world, the best investments to deliver a long-term return in a way which helps manage the volatility through all of these different aspects, whether it's a UK election, whether it's a US election.
I was going to ask about that. Do you think the US election will have more impact on people's portfolios than the one we're having right here?
Yeah, I think, that certainly, you feel it in every conversation which you have with asset managers, or you read asset market press. It's all sort of starting to point towards the US, and again, we can see where the polls are currently pointing, but they can change quite materially. The more we find out about how they intend to sort of what their plans are and how they intend to deliver, we'll be discussing it more and more.
Well, what is, so I mean, just let's focus on the US for a second. I mean, this is predominantly about the UK election, but just in terms of the US, the polls are much tighter there. Right? There isn't a 20-point gap between Biden and Trump. I know they've still got to have their absolute, their conventions and things yet, but it's going to be those two, barring anything unforeseen along the way. There's only a couple of % difference. Whereas in this country, markets, as you've said, can almost price in a result because it's been that way for so long. Can't do that in America. Are you seeing more volatility over there as a result, or are we still quite a way off the election, so that volatility hasn't quite peaked yet? Or
we're not seeing the volatility yet. I think if the polls narrow, which they're likely to do as more and more voters get tuned in, particularly as the debates come to a conclusion early autumn, I think you're likely to see more pricing of the Trump risk inevitably, but that will be a process. It's not going to happen this month. It's likely to be.
But he went last time round, in terms of when he won the election, he went big on tax cuts.
Yes.
But
markets were priced for Hillary. That's the thing. So when he was first elected,
okay.
markets were priced for Hillary Clinton. And that's why the stock market did so well.
Yeah,
basically from the moment he was elected, because they knew he was a sort of pro-tax cut, pro-business, pro-stock market type of fella.
Okay.
And he followed through with that. So... but he doesn't have the same sort of space to do the same things this time round. Yeah. Joe Biden's doing many of the policies Trump would love to do.
Okay.
So we're not seeing the volatility yet.
And the difference there being, you've got whoever's in the White House, but also who's in charge of Congress as well, which is going to have a key impact in terms of what they can do, how quickly can they do it, and to what extent. That could curtail a lot of plans, or it could sort of enable plans, but likewise in the UK, big pile of debt in the US, and debt is more expensive to finance. They have to be very considerate of that.
Yeah. Let's just bring it back home then. Inheritance tax, was there anything you picked up on inheritance tax in any of either the manifestos or just even the conversations over the last? It seems to have been. It used to be a bit of a sort of centrepiece policy at around election time, but I've not seen anything about inheritance tax this time.
Well, Labour are so they're going to have almost an extra 1,000 people at HMRC.
Yeah.
I think with the focus on IHT avoidance through trusts. I think so, or offshore vehicles. So.
So more sort of clamping down than a retail, if you like, what they call a retail policy, which is something people can sort of vote for. It's more clamping down on things.
Yeah, again, it seems quite abstract. It's just a single bullet point in the manifesto summary, but that seems to be the focus, which is this idea that there are large pockets of taxes being hidden, and so they appear to be back in HMRC this time.
But they've also said they're not going to raise IHT as well, which for me was one of the biggest surprises that came out of it. It's something that when we think about, obviously, inheritance tax, it comes back down to the rich person's tax effectively. But as has been discussed on this podcast, it's something that is starting to affect more and more people. I was quite surprised by that as one of the main manifesto points that fully expected to see. The other thing with Labour's manifesto as well was the lack of mention or clarity around the capital gains situation. That was the other one that quite surprised me. I thought that it may have been something that they just at least made a key point about. They've touched on income, they've touched on NI, they've touched on VAT, but they left out capital gains again, which I know we've discussed it, but those two, I expected at least a change out of one of IHT or CGT from that side.
Yeah,
I think as Kevin was saying before, there's such a stress on the tax system. It's actually there's not a huge amount of wiggle room. Get the word out. There's not a huge amount of wiggle room. So you end up in.
Try again.
I know. I can say it. You can tell it's splitting out, but you're kind of in a. It's interesting, which is I think the reason why you haven't seen the polls shift, because it is just it's pretty boring. Let's be honest. There's not a huge amount of change or anything like this. If you look at we talked around the Labour and the VAT, but other than that, it's pretty boring, isn't it? Which is the way I would take it if I was them. By the way, I get that. But even the Tories, there's just so little room for manoeuvring, which is why I think from perspective of markets, etc., we kind of know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I think it's inevitable.
Right then, I'm going to ask you, not for a prediction, but just how do you think this election we're having now compares to previous elections? I mean, where does it rank? Is it one of the most dull and boring, or one of the most exciting? Because we might be getting a big change. Who knows? How do you all rank this election then? Given, I guess, compare it to elections that you've voted in previously. Where does it rank? I'll start with you, James.
We've just touched on it, a little bit boring. I am finding this election a little bit boring. There's nothing that is surprising me at all, apart from the Lib Dem social media is the only thing that's surprising me at the minute.
Be enjoying that part of it.
I enjoyed their ranking of the dogs. That was the other one, the dogs that they've met on their tour.
Great.
Nothing too special, or which I quite like. Means nothing to worry about should new government come in terms of major changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier, didn't we? Which is when you kind of look at, the elections that I've kind of been through. You look at, Tony Blair, John Major. Tony Blair came in with, how did we describe before, using enthusiastic and people
energy.
like that.
People gravitate towards energy.
Yeah, and you had the same with sort of Cameron against Gordon Brown and
Boris against Corbyn.
Corbyn.
It was always the energec.
Yeah, they go for it.
People would gravitate towards that.
And then both of these two don't look like they've got any energy to me. I watched Sunak last night, who just looked a broken man when he was doing his section of it, which is slightly worrying. But I don't know. I kind of feel that there's certain moments. If you look at the sort of the bigger moment with Gordon Brown, that felt very similar to the D-Day moment with Sunak, which is why did you do that?
Yeah.
I just hope, from our perspective, like, and from a business and giving advice to clients' perspective, what's quite good for us is just having a bit of certainty. It's very difficult to when we're giving advice to clients, we've got to base our advice on current legislation and current rules, etc. Quite rightly, but having tweaks to CGT, having tweaks to income tax, etc. When you're setting plans for clients and goals and objectives for clients, if that you don't want that to change too often. Especially, the average client that we recommend, you're talking 35 to 40 years worth of savings. So, to have changes during that period can be really challenging. We talked about lifetime allowance being changed by the Tories last year, and then Labour saying potentially put back in. That's not helpful. That's definitely not helpful for us. So just for me, whoever comes in, if we can just say, just a bit of stability, not messing around with pensions would be my key thing. If we just leave them alone, then... And as I said, I don't think there's wiggle room, Peter, to do that anyway. So
well done.
Got it eventually.
Kevin, how does this election score for you?
If the polls are right, the Labour Party will be the most powerful parliamentary party in Europe in post-war history. They could have 150 to 200 seat majority, and they will be able to do almost nothing. Because the tax burden is so high and the natural growth impulse is so low.
Yeah.
What makes it so different from 1997 when Labour last came into power was there was a massive underlying productivity boom in the UK since the late 80s and all the way through to about the late noughties. The UK enjoyed a 20-year productivity boom. So government could in effect step back and just watch the economy grow, and there'd be additional tax receipts from that. We're not going to get that this time round, and the spending requirements for the NHS, for the welfare state are so high, and the interest rate bill are so high that there's nothing really left to stimulate the economy. So it's one of the reasons I'm delighted George pointed out that most of our clients' assets are in overseas securities and are diversified because the UK growth story isn't that great. It's not really a great place to outperform. So I think it's going to be interesting that there are going to be potentially almost 400 Labour MPs who are going to realise that it could be a very, very boring 5 years.
Yeah.
And therein lies the trouble.
Because that's where the infighting starts.
Well, exactly. That's the trouble for Keir Starmer. If he ends up with a majority like that, Jamie and I were talking about this earlier on today, there's only maybe 150 or so government jobs to go around. That's a lot of Labour backbenchers realising they ain't going to get a job, which is really the only power you have over them, to behave. And that's a lot of MPs thinking, well, I'll just speak my mind then, and who cares if I rock the boat because I'm not getting a job anyway. I'm sorry to bring it down to that, but that's a lot of the way they think. George, a classic election for you or not? So far?
So far, I mean, what's interesting is the starting point. So, very ambitious plans starting from very low levels of economic growth, but a big pile of debt that they've got to navigate through. So you could debate, how they get about that, and that's the interesting aspect. In terms of the campaign itself, I think they've been pretty dull so far. There's no real characters in amongst it all, which means that actually watching the campaigns can be quite painful at times. But, it's an interesting starting point, which we've got. And there are some interesting policies, which we've discussed in there today. So let's see what happens. Let's, we'll keep giving our view as to how things are evolving, I'm sure. But, I think, what's it mean for portfolios? There's much bigger aspects out there to contend with. And largely, what we're seeing on the global stage is a better outlook, actually. A number of things which are improving. The economy, we're seeing in terms of what it means for corporations. They've demonstrated resilience in a higher interest rate environment. Earnings are improving, not just in the US, but outside as well, even here in the UK as well. So, we're fairly constructive on the outlook, and not getting bogged down by the headlines of UK politics.
Yeah. Good. This is the point in a podcast or a political debate where normally the interviewer chucks a gotcha question at you, a question that you hadn't seen coming, right? So we've had a couple of those things like, I remember under Theresa May, it was, what's the naughtiest thing you've ever done? I'm not going to ask that question because Jamie would take it. He's got a long list to choose from. So
I've ran through a few fields.
Have you? I bet you have. I'm not going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you whether you had Sky TV as a kid. Because I can't answer that because it wasn't around when I'm so young. What I will ask you, Rishi Sunak came up with an odd one yesterday on the Sky debate when he was asked what something we didn't know about him, and he said he likes Haribos and Twixes. So I'm going to ask you: are you a Haribo man or a Twix man, George?
Twix.
Haribo.
Haribo.
Haribos win.
I'll get all the Twixes.
I'm a Haribo. So you're outnumbered, George. I'm a Haribo man. I'm not going to vote for you now.
Well,
it can come down to something as silly as that. Anyway, look, there we are. So that's been really useful, actually, because we have got through. There's loads more announcements, and if you want to spend your time reading a 200-page manifesto times by every party there is, good luck to you. But I think hopefully we've pulled out some of the main points there, especially the ones that could affect you. But as George has quite rightly said, and Kevin as well, there are other bigger issues, let's say, that will affect your investments, and that's the reason why you should subscribe to this channel, because we talk about them every day on Morning Markets. We talk about them every week in the podcast as well, so we do keep you, we hope, very much up to date with the things that do affect your money. And as you hear from the guys at the end of the table, they are focused resolutely on whatever happens in this country and others, looking after your money and helping you do more with it, as we say here at True Potential. So for now, thank you to George, to Kevin, to Jamie, and to James as well. Thank you to you for tuning in this week, and please do give us a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you next time on this podcast. Bye for now.